let me introduce Greg Lynn, which I think everybody knows, but nevertheless, I think Greg is one of those true creatures that we can say that is before and after in our field, because of things that he brought to the table, and he's an innovator in every aspect of it. So I thought it would be interesting because as we move forward, we remove more and more from the origin of many things that we take as a given. It's always good to revisit and to trace evolution. And I think you're going to talk about a bunch of things that you've been working on in recent years, and some things are a little bit older. So to have you to talk in the context of this, and many of the students that are here, many of the people that will be watching in YouTube are moving into thesis. So there is a lot of trying to understand where we should go from here, how design and digital toolings and all that has implicated that. So I cannot think of anybody better than you. I have the pleasure to know Greg for more than 20 years. He was my teacher. We're friends and colleagues for a long time. I'm proud to say he's one of the persons that influenced me the most, and I learned a lot. So it's always fun to have the chance to hear him speak. So Greg, the Zoom window is all yours.
I wanted to talk to Hernán about the archaeology of the digital project and all the things that were discovered by going back into the archive. But unfortunately, I couldn't dig it up digitally and didn't have time to run in and open the office up and grab it. So, but I did have this, I've kind of picked some things out that goes back in time and focuses on some themes that in the early 90s were, I would say, very expansive themes and very experimental. And for me, it's very funny. They all, it's not even that they came full circle. It's just kind of nothing changed. Everything just evolved. I mean, I have to say my aesthetic and compositional intuitions have changed substantially, but conceptual interests and technical interests have remained very constant. So I pulled together this little autobiography. You know, before I even went to undergraduate school, I was using a real primitive computer with CAD software, and in undergraduate school got very interested in a program called MicroStation, which was purchased by Bentley, and it was a thing where you could draw splines. And it was because I had a rubber, a set of metal discs on a rubber strip, which was called a spline, which was, I had a German one, and it would let you draw curves without drawing using French curve templates. You could actually make what you'd call CVs now, but you would make points with an XY coordinate and be able to draw curves and scale them by buying bigger and bigger mechanical splines. So in order to get a hold of the best spline software, I actually started, you know, talking my way into getting software. I bought a used Silicon Graphics computer way back when, and got software that would draw splines. It also had, as part of it, the ability to simulate physics, meaning you could model with gravity and things. It did a lot of particle animations, which were used for the special effects industry. And it had inverse kinematics, which is where you would build a skeleton and be able to modify a spline surface by animating that skeleton. So those three things, I mean, I'm CEO of a robotics company right now where we do blob recognition to identify people, and we do spline tracking to do our path planning. So splines and blobs, it still is all totally relevant and very similar. So I just thought I'd walk through some of that early stuff, tell you what changed and what didn't change. For me, the digital tools, as we use them, and it was, you know, not just me, it was frankly everybody. And that means, you know, from Frank Gehry's office to, you know, the youngest people around. One of the things that the computer promised to us was complexity management. So every single part of a building could suddenly be absolutely unique. And the computer was a thing that would handle that level of complexity in a way that you couldn't do it if you were mechanically drafting it. Now, I have to say, there was a group of people like Hani Rashid and Lisanne Couture, predominantly, who were looking at the computer for its ability to texture map surfaces with images, to build virtual worlds like the virtual stock exchange. There were also people like, I would say Lars Sprybrook was the dominant one, who was looking at the computer as a way of building interactive architecture, where the architecture would move and transform. Klaus Oosterhuis is another one of those people. And what's funny is the complexity management part was adopted by the building industry, but companies like Facebook, Google, Magic Leap, they've all built an entire culture on the virtual reality, texture mapping. Like, what's really moved culture is actually what the architects all just abandoned. But they were all there very, very early, I would say. I think the field did go down a bit of a rabbit hole where the ability to manage complexity became the ability to talk to the machines that would fabricate the building components. And I think for me, the ability to give a machine instructions to manufacture parts was the extreme limit of that kind of complexity management. Probably the most interesting and somewhat tragic realization was in the gallery at SCI-Arc, where we built the blob wall pavilion, and realized when you had 2,000 or 3,000 unique bricks and you tried to put them together, that complexity level was just too high. I would say that was actually the highest complexity thing I ever tried to assemble. So at a certain point, it became clear that the digital was both letting you manage complexity. It was also just increasing complication. I won't really go too much into it, but there was a moment where I started working with industrial processes, this with Alessi, and this with Vitra, where I came with a digital process and a digital aesthetic, and by Rolf Fellbaum and Alberto Alessi was kind of told, look, what you're doing is not actually innovative. Like, because I had proposed to Rolf a chair that was going to be 3D printed, and every single one of the chairs would be different. Same thing with Alessi. I designed these molds where we could superform titanium, where every T set would be unique. And Alberto said, no, well, we're selling these sets for $70,000, so they're art. And nobody wants to buy a unique artwork. They want, if it's an edition, they want to know that they're buying the same one that the other people buy, because their biggest fear is that theirs isn't as good as the other person's. So, and he said, look at photography. You sell photography, and in addition, you make the edition all at once. People won't even buy a photograph that's been printed after the earlier ones because they're afraid they're getting a bad one. So even though we built this ability to do bespoke, and even though we built this ability to do one-of-a-kind mass production, I personally found that the world was not actually as interested in that as I thought they were. It was more that it was possible. So with both of those projects, I started to move towards a very radical reduction of components and tried to build things as high performance as possible, where I would integrate as many elements as possible into as few parts as you could build. So this chair, the ravioli chair, it has more than two pieces, but it really just has two parts. It has a soft top, it has a hard bottom, the back, the arms, the seat, the legs, all of the components of a chair, which normally you have 2 or 3 dozen components minimum, were all reduced down to just 2 parts. And those 2 parts stacked up like potato chips for logistics. So I started to get very interested in how things get assembled, how they get shipped, moved, manufactured, and how to make them as high performance as possible and turn back to a lot of the same digital tools. So the simulated physics that I was using with Wavefront, and to a certain extent, Softimage, although hardly ever, those same particle physics, or those same computational fluid dynamics physics engines I used to design this boat. And the concerns for this boat, and I designed it with Fred Karubla, who's a naval and aerospace engineer and designer. The key things are it has to be as light as possible because it flies out of the water on very small carbon fiber foils. So the ability to model it using physics and computational fluid dynamics was taking me all the way back to like the earliest projects like Port Authority, Bus Terminal, and things like that. Literally the same software in some cases, just much more powerful computers. Even this, we had to get not really a render farm, but a farm of, it was over 120 computers with 8 processors each, and it would take a week to do what you just saw. So very computationally intensive. The CNC machines just got bigger, but absolutely the same as we did like with the embryological house in the mid 90s. So here at Bill Chrysler's just using a 15-foot long or 15-meter long CNC machine to make molds. And that produced an object which, just like in the book Animate Form, which I forget the date of, where I use the boat metaphor, I mean, this is a form.
98.
98? So this is a form that actually moves just because of the shape it is. So there's no motor, there's nobody pushing it. It literally just behaves and performs because of the nature of the shape. And the way you achieve that shape is by modeling it in a simulated physics and CFD environment. This is just like, notice the power boat. I think that's probably the thing. But so this boat is, not only passing that sailboat, but it's also passing the power boat. So it's a boat that goes like 25, 30 miles an hour in 10 or 12 knots of wind. It does it because of the shape of the hulls and the shape of those foils, and also the shape of the sails. But for me, it's an argument for the performance value of form. It's really, I have to say, for me, one of the high points of my life to design a thing and have it go 30 miles an hour just because of what shape I made. It's a strong argument for the value of form making. I would say the new things for me are actually the pressures I like to put on projects. So this is an office building for medics in Manisa, Turkey. They weave a lot of composites. They actually were the weavers of all the carbon that was used in my boat. And so we're building the first building envelope that's 100% composite construction. So, and they're manufacturing each of these panels as a super panel in the factory and then craning it from the factory onto the building. And if you look at that big canopy on the roof, that'll be built in 2 halves they'll bond it together on the ground and lift that as a crane as one element onto the building. So reducing the number of parts of the building like ridiculously low and making them as lightweight and high performance as possible, so you can achieve different results. Then the last thing I would say is that the, programming of form generation operations very seamlessly turned into the programming of robotic structures, where we started building our own homemade robots. So this was for the Interior Festival in Kortrijk, Belgium. And we did this kind of rolling RV house. From that programming, we were asked by Nike to make a microclimate chair for NBA athletes, where we would be able to modulate an environment more or less against the body surface of basketball players, and be able to heat and cool them down, as well as weigh them, measure the oxygen level around them, and also we got a few things actually just wrong. Like we thought we needed to cool their or dry their hands and things like that. So it's got air pressure that blows from the perimeter in a 3D printed capillary system. It's got, if you see kind of transparently those white squares, those are all Peltier chips that we can selectively heat and cool. We had everything designed for a specific basketball player, but we found out actually basketball teams have kind of a small, medium, and large player. They have like one small one, two big ones, and then everybody else is pretty much the same size. So we ended up doing these like the sizes of shoes. And instead of automatically heating and cooling with the microprocessor in the chair, in testing with the athletes, we just gave the athletes the control. And actually what we found is all the athletes turned it up as hot as they could get it, because Kobe Bryant always liked to be as hot as possible. And they thought if he liked to be as hot as possible, they wanted to be as hot as they could bear. So in the end, it was a much simpler system than we thought, but it was, pretty much a big climatic robot. So that's the smallest player you'd want in a very large, that's 7'2", and I think he claims he's 5'7". I think he's more like 5'4". So you can see like the range of sizes of that. The first like building scale robot I did was this curbside pavilion, where actually business-wise, I really only like to work for people where I have an ownership in the building or the product. This was the first time I was able to convince somebody that was a mutually beneficial relationship. So for Curbside Corporation, we built these composite buildings that were light enough, and they were really only 5 pieces. So we could bring these to a site, set it up in a day, take it apart in a day, and they were deployable and very prototypical. They have a long distance Bluetooth receiver in that top pin, which is an antenna, and that moves, and the face of that pin changes color to match the background screen on your phone. So when you pull up to pick up your package at curbside, you know which one of these pavilions to pull up to. So through that, I learned a lot about business and startups and developing a commercial product. So I would say in the last year and a half, I've been CEO of a company, Piaggio Fast Forward, where I would say a lot of this knowledge comes all back together. I mean, from running the design team and producing an industrial product, and it's an industrial product that's a robot. So it senses people, it identifies what a person looks like. It does gesture analysis of them and follows them. And frankly, probably the most valuable thing as a company we have is an understanding of pedestrian etiquette. And so we know like how people hold a door for another person to walk through the door. We know where the person stands to wait for the person that's holding the door for them. We know how people move in a crowd. We know how much a person's shoulder turns before they're going to turn a corner. We have a huge depth of information about pedestrianism that frankly only a group of architects would think was valuable, but also totally surprising. Like I never thought about how a person walks through a door, but now I know like all the details of how you walk through all kinds of different doors. But so anyway, it brings together the programming, the software, the interest in industrial products, the interest in ergonomics and simplification. And like I said before, it does blob detection and spline path planning. It's like all the geometric and technical things from the late 80s and early 90s are still totally relevant and absolutely central to the design of the product. So, I mean, as a kind of a trajectory, you know, I would say that the technical skills you're learning now will actually not change in 20 years. They'll deepen, they'll get more sophisticated. They won't get replaced, and they will definitely deepen. I think how you use them and how you, leverage them for different things. Also, whatever you're doing now as students will be very similar to what you're doing 20 years from now. I mean, for me, I wouldn't think I'd be CEO of a robotics company, but I think if you were to place a bet on young architects that might be CEOs of robotics companies, I would have probably been in the top dozen or so. So whatever you're doing now is going to set you up for what you're going to do forever. Even though you may have a bunch of different jobs and careers, you'll still be doing stuff that's very similar, at least in my experience and all my colleagues' experience.
Cool. Great. Thank you, Greg. As we always do in this time is when we invite people that maybe were watching YouTube, they can join us here for the conversation part. Since it's a manageable group of people, you can ask a question via chat, or you can also ask in person if you want. Either way, I try to navigate the traffic as good as I can. But let me start with something basic, Greg, and this is something that, and I think in a way you touch over the different subjects that you talk. But if I ask you to elaborate in the kind of oversimplification, it will say 25 to 30 years in the massive eruption of computation in architecture, and your work and the way that you relate to your work and the way that you filter and you contaminate your work has changed over the years. I mean, like before we started, Graham was talking about, I mean, okay, your background in philosophy, but early on there was a kind of philosophical theoretical component. Then you start to sparkle that with a lot of pop culture understanding to it. Of course, technology was always embedded in it, but the other factors they were playing on, and I think maybe have to do with opportunities, but also have to do with your own interest. But it will be interesting maybe if we take those 25 years and we make it into four moments. How do you think it has been evolving? Because I remember your early argument when I was a student, but then I remember 4 or 5 years later in the Aspen conference, you saying, I want to be the form finder, which was probably something you would say something different 5, 6 years before that, which I think is interesting because I think it was the level of partnership with the technology changed over the years and the level of control. But I think, especially since we have this interests me since we have an audience of students, which we take a lot of things for granted, but it will be interesting for you to give us maybe with your own trajectory only, in these 25 to 30 years, you will divide it in 3 or 4 periods, what there will be, and the relation with design and aesthetics and all the other aspects that you use to define your work.
Well, certainly I would say, well, one thing I never thought about, and one thing they never teach you in architecture school, which they do teach you in other things, is a concern for your audience. And I mean not like an audience like you're giving a lecture, but I actually mean like how your work's going to be received and what context it's going to have an influence on. So, you know, of course, right after I graduated, I really wanted to make sure that I went to an architecture firm that where I could learn by watching somebody else. And that's when I went to work for Antoine Predock for a short time and for Peter Eisenman for 5 years. And during that period, I was very much involved in, I would say, a conventional architectural practice predominantly, meaning like working on the Cincinnati School of Design, Art, Architecture, and Planning, and Carnegie Mellon, and a few projects. But at the same time was, you know, talking to the people that came through the office and organizing some seminars in the office, and also helping out wherever I could with any publications and magazines and things like that. So I would say that period was the most conventional of my life. Ironically, Peter would kill me if he ever heard me say that, but it was the most conventional architectural time I've ever had. I think then when I left, that's actually where I started to explore like a lot of 3D printing and a lot of manufacturing interests, I would say, like with artist space and things like that, like trying to use big laser cutters and 3D printers and things. And it's also probably where animation became such a dominant thing. So it was very, I would say, like doing things on the screen and trying to get things off the screen to machines. And so that would have been probably the most abstract time of my life. So those bracketed by those two things, I would say there was a lot of whiplash. I, ever since then, like to really be bouncing back and forth at the intersection of, let's say experimental digital approaches to things and very physical output. So, I mean, I could give you 3 phases. I don't know if I could give you 4.
Well, three is good enough. I mean, it was more like I think part of what is interesting about this kind of a Zoom conversation is that we get to talk more like in a dinner manner than in academic context. So these are kind of things that we will talk over drinks or something like that. Please, if anybody has a question, please put it in the chat or ask directly. And just unmute your microphone and ask or type it. If not, I'll keep asking questions. But I want everybody to use this opportunity. We have one from Burak, Greg. He says, "Hi, Greg. Thank you for being here. My question is about artificial intelligence. Since computational design is on the table for more than 20 years, as a pioneer of the field, what do you think of the role of AI for the future of design and experimentation?"
So I'll say in the last 4 years, for a while we were using machine learning and machine training on the JITA robots. Frankly, we've found that, let's say, massively large sets of data that we observe and analyze is more valuable to us, where we're actually guiding the programming. than, what you'd call brute force artificial intelligence, where you're either training or trying to have a machine learn best practices. I think even Waymo and Tesla doing self-driving cars would probably agree with me that the machine learning and training it's tough to get a usable result from it. I will say that at the Angewandte in Vienna, we've had now a couple of projects where the students try to train a machine to design Corbusian villas or lay out, let's say, fill in profiles with architectural vocabulary. And it's pretty impressive. It's very reminiscent to setting up like 9 curves, which are compatible and generating 50,000 houses. It feels a lot like that. It still very much needs the guidance of human intelligence. It's also artificial intelligence used in machine training. It's tough to reuse your data sets, because by the time you've built up that database to try to train a machine to do something, if you change your mind, pretty much have to start back from zero. But I definitely think the rote service-oriented tasks that architects perform are ripe to be replaced by machines, for sure. Like if you're looking at an industry where you could optimize a lot of simple, detailed diligence of tasks, architecture and engineering is for sure one of the places you would focus on. So, I mean, laying out bathrooms, figuring out how to optimize office layouts, figuring out how to make desks a little bit smaller in WeWork spaces. These are all the places that machine learning is having its biggest impact on architecture. And frankly, it'll put a huge number of people out of work. I mean, I used to joke back when Elena was in the office that pretty soon I'd be sitting alone with a bunch of machines. And frankly, it'll definitely be like that for a lot of stuff. You don't need 80 people in a drafting room anymore. That's for sure.
You just mentioned Elena. Elena posed a question for you here, Greg. She says, what do you think architecture students should learn today?
Oh my God. Okay.
Well, we're not going to make it easy for you. I mean, it's a relaxed talk, but what the hell?
Well, I'll tell you, the thing that I'm teaching a lot is machine vision. How to teach machines.
Elena's clarifying a selfish question.
Yeah. No, the one thing we're teaching a ton is machine vision. And we combine with that using mostly game engine software to do simulations of large groups of people and things moving through buildings. But I don't think that's what students should learn today. I mean, I think that's what I'm doing, but I'm not the standard for sure. Like, I would never take what I'm doing and say like, oh, everybody should do this. I think like, a small number of people can make very significant contributions, teaching buildings how to watch the people in them, teaching furniture how to locate itself in space and follow people around, teaching doors when to open and close, and teaching windows where to open and close, teaching partitions where to move during the day. Like, I think that's all significant work, but I would never say that like all the architecture students should focus on that. That'd be ridiculous.
Since we are on the selfish side of question, which I think Elena is right, and I'll pose my selfish question here, Greg. One of the things I'm fascinated by it, and I fascinated and disturbed and excited all in one is in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen in schools of architecture kind of a rebirth of precedent and historical understanding of things. As somebody like you that worked for Michael Graves, you saw that firsthand in one period. And I call it like a digital POMO.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder why that was the case in a way that we almost, in certain contexts, we choose to ignore the last 25 years, like this has been figured out. And we need to go and revisit things and do it with kind of a different techniques and technologies, but that the principles are the same. So I wonder why do you think that has been that reaction, and why that kind of the project that was, which I think it continued, I'm not saying no, but it has been challenged and tried to be refocused or reconfigured with some kind of a more conventional way to understand the discipline.
Well, I mean, I think architecture is a very odd field in that it's constantly oscillating between, let's say, rethinking the world and refining everything that it does. And for me, I've seen it happen on probably like every decade or so. It goes through, let's say, a more, a less in control period. And then everybody gets nervous, and then all of a sudden everybody's talking about refinement. And even in architects, you know, their careers, you see that oscillation between out of control and refinement. So I take the whole focus on neo-rationalism and returning back to, you know, stylistic postmodernism as an attempt to refine things, just because probably what preceded it is frankly pretty unrefinable. I mean, like, Hernán, if you decided to start to refine your work, or Elena decided to start to refine her work, that would be like that's a pretty tall order. Like, I don't even know what the point would be. But I take a lot of that kind of neo-rationalist interest in, you know, in a refinement equaling reduction somehow. And, you know, honestly, I'll totally take most of the postmodernism revival now over actually the real postmodernism I lived through in the 80s. I mean, it does improve. It is definitely better.
I never thought it that way, but I think you have a fair point there.
Yeah. No, I mean, that like, you know, I believe in progress, and it's definitely better than it was. Your average postmodern is better now than it was.
Okay, we have another question from Sihan. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Hi, Greg. May I ask you, what do you think the years of training and working as a disciplinary architect help you to develop the work that you are doing now? Thank you for sharing.
Well, I mean, what you know, what I so loved about being in Peter's office was, let's say, the depth of knowledge of the discipline. So, you know, just understanding that you were in a dialogue with hundreds of years of architecture, and the struggle to communicate that clearly to as many people as possible. So, and that's also, you know, working for a person who's a teacher. Like, I really respect most architects that continue to teach even in their 90s, because it shows that there's a desire to communicate. And to communicate, I would say, to the, you know, to the largest possible number of people. Like, I used to love watching Peter go in and talk to an athletic director about a stadium, and talk to an athletic director about Piranesi in a football stadium. Like, to me, that's like the greatest thing on earth. So, and I'm a very big believer in trying to get everybody in the field to speak more clearly, because I think a lot of people actually they don't get the message always from architecture, and that was the biggest thing I got from Peter. Is he was a great teacher, great communicator, and huge amount of depth in the field.
We have another one from Elena. Greg, what would you say is your most important contribution to the field?
That's
your
a
time to be
question for
selfish.
you, Elena. I have no idea. I mean, I gotta say, I have a absolute disinterest in contributing to the field. I mean, only to the extent that I would like the field to be more like what I like, just because it's more fun to be surrounded by stuff you want to do. But yeah, I have no idea.
We have one from Charlie. Greg, have you witnessed disciplinary rift between architects and the other camp from which you probably hire engineers, software and hardware, marketeers, sociologists, etc.? Is architectural education poised to produce architects as interdisciplinary as you think it should be?
Interesting. Well, I mean, architecture is very popular right now, and it's still very popular to have an architect or a designer, an industrial designer on the board of your major corporation. And because of it, there's a kind of McKinsey group approach to design. I mean, kind of like a little bit what IDEO does. I would say that's the only place I really have risks with people, is in that treating design as a consultancy, but I think there's a lot of that in the business world. I think in the design world, no. I think actually there's not a lot of debate. It's not as much debate now as there was 20 years ago.
We have a question for at.arc. I guess this is, from your perspective, you think a phenomenological approach in architecture will still exist in a post-digital world?
Wow. I would have to understand so much about the assumptions behind that question to answer it. Goodness.
Okay, well, let's see.
Nothing has been as abused. Phenomenology has never been more abused by a discipline than it has been by architecture. So I'm very cautious about answering those kinds of questions. Like, could you have a Ken Frampton of critical regionalism in the digital world? Sure, that'd be super interesting. Like, I would love to know what a digital critical regionalist is, but I think it's possible.
Fair enough.
I mean, maybe there is a digital Ken Frampton already.
That's a scary thought. That's a scary thought. Anybody else want to jump in? There are so many familiar faces. Okay, so I guess I have one. It's more like a, well, yeah, I think I guess it's a question in a way, but I think part of the issue is, I think, it have to do with the notion of relevance for architecture moving forward. I think this is always a moving target, and to me, it's always I always intrigued by that. And I think when I look all the kind of work, all the arch that you operate, to me, it's an interesting issue to keep thinking about that, and how do we define that, and how the idea of an architectural thinking can be deployed in a way that we can start to cut relevance. And I think it will be irresponsible on my part to don't ask in relation to the crisis that we're going through right now, which is going to define things to come, and we're going to be discussing this for come. how much do you think we're going to have to adapt and rethink what is the role, what is the relevance of architecture operating in this? I'm not talking architecture as building, but architecture as a way to understand relationships, architecture as a way to think the world through it, in which right now we all becoming kind of prisoners of the most traditional sense of architecture. Not but prison is the wrong word, but we all can embed it in living in the architecture that surrounds us. But moving forward, it's going to be interesting to try to understand what it means, because I would argue that in many part of practices like yours and exploration like yours have to do with a mutation of what architecture relevance has been in the last 30, 40 years and how that's been expanding. So I'm curious, and I know it's pure speculation because we're in the middle of it, how much this will mutate and evolve as we move forward. And just for the sake of it, and it's our job to speculate, how much you think that this is going to shift things?
Yep. Well, one thing I'll say for sure is not everybody is an advocate for the civic aspects of society. Like let's say the city, whatever that civic spatial infrastructure is. Not everybody is an advocate for doing the best for citizens. And it's very maybe naive, but and adorable that architecture still remains one of the few fields where your core job is improving the world for as many people as possible. And that's why people get into the field. And that's why people stay in the field, is because they actually do want to change the world and do it spatially and physically. And I could only assume that the new normal is going to put a higher value and more preciousness on that civic, physical part of what everybody shares. But there really aren't that many fields that still put that high on their criteria. It's more like if you can do it, like while you're building a robot that puts all the fast food workers and truck drivers out of business, if you can make the world a better place while you do that, well, that would be nice to do. Or while you're developing a social networking app, if you can actually improve the lives of people with that, well, that would be a nice thing to try to do, So, it's like do no evil is very different than do something good. So
since we are entering in the final push of this, a little bit a kind of more fun one and lighter touch from Jackie. What shows are you watching these days during quarantine?
Oh
I think we are looking for suggestions.
Oh no, Jackie, like you're killing me because tomorrow I have an all hands meeting at 7 a.m. that I'm not even ready for. So I have like 2.5 or 3 more hours of work, and then I'll be up at 5:30, talking to leadership and getting ready for our all hands. I really was promised that I was going to catch up on Netflix and watch everything during this, and I'm getting totally ripped off because I love television. But I watch like 15 minutes of it as I'm passing out at night. So, gosh, I guess maybe I could tell you what I wish I was watching. Like I certainly wish I was watching Ozark, but I haven't been able to. I mean, the last thing I watched Tiger King with my kids. But that was like, I don't even remember how long ago.
Yeah, Ozark is amazing. Another familiar name and a familiar face, Greg, from Christie. How will JITA change the physical world? Puffy railings, curbs on ramps, machine-only elevators, conveyors?
Interesting. Well, so, I mean, JITA is really designed to replace Uber trips. Well, not Uber, Lyft, whatever, like ride hailing and and car trips. So, I mean, honestly, what we're hoping is that, and actually the people that are buying JITA, they're the people that are not living in the 3 largest cities in America, but that are living in places where they can walk to shop, walk to a farmer's market, walk to a school, all that kind of stuff. So I don't really think we need to change the physical world. Like if it was a JITA per every 10 people, it would become a sidewalk problem. But I don't think that's gonna happen. But it really is, you know, it doesn't really need anything special. I will say that like our product pipeline has things that are more for being inside buildings, where JITA is really meant for being on sidewalks. And inside buildings, I think there's a whole lot of questions. Like one of the things that we look at in the studios I teach is, do machines like a JITA belong in ductwork, or do they belong with people? Do they go through the same front door, or should they have like a little dog door? You know, I think that kind of stuff is very interesting. But frankly, I think it's more a question of, how do you design a space where the furniture and some of the walls are intelligent enough to know where to go and where to be? And, you know, how do you design a world where the spaces are watching the people in them and adapting to them? Which frankly, you know, one of the things about WeWork is they had over 100 architects and data scientists doing exactly that, like watching, even if people were smiling, and giving them feedback on how to lay the space out. So it was more or less like if you were raising chickens, you figure out how to trick a chicken into thinking that 17 hours is actually 24 hours so you can grow a chicken faster. That's like what WeWork was doing, but what they were using to do it was pretty amazing. I mean, in terms of an intelligent building. So I think that's the thing you're going to see change. I mean, you already do with thermostats and lights and stuff like that, but I think buildings are going to change a lot, and they're going to actually be much more sentient.
Okay, I think the last two, Greg, and we'll let you go to sleep for your tomorrow meeting. For Elena, are schools still the place where innovation takes place?
How interesting. Yes, for sure they are. For sure they are. I think it's more that the large corporate office is more interesting than it's ever been. I never thought I would say that, but Gensler, AECom, WeWork, Katera, I mean, places like that are understanding they have to innovate or they'll die. And so those places they're interesting. You know, which is those are different than just your standard corporate architecture practice. But yeah, sure, schools are where the innovation takes place. Yeah, but I do think it's a fantasy that, I mean, like what I bring to the school is like the newest thing that I'm working on, and then give it away and then get to see where it goes. And I would say that lately I've seen it go into these big engineering practices, which I never saw before. Used to be they'd go to kind of small and medium practices, but lately when I bring things into the university and see where it goes, it's starting to go to big corporate infrastructure, large scale urbanism. They're the people that are more worried about mobility and you know, like say machine intelligence in buildings. Yep, most young people don't really care about that stuff.
I'm going to give the last one to Richard Mipes. I'd like to know more what you were saying concerning public space. It seems like parts of public space are becoming bracketed out by platforms like social media. Do you think this makes physical public space more an exclusive arena for architects and designers?
Gosh, I don't know if I see that trend. I mean, you know, a company I love is Niantic. And that's the only company that's ever spun out of Google that's made a profit. Otherwise, they all spin out and die. They're the only one that spun out and flourished. And they're the company that makes Pokemon Go. And if you look at like the statistics on Pokemon Go and then you read their mission statement, it's incredible how what they wanted is exactly what they got. They said, we want to make people more active. We want people to use technology to go outside and meet people. We want elderly people to discover technology. We want to have people travel around the world because they want to see new places because of our technology. Like everything they wanted to do before they made Pokemon Go is exactly what happened. And I think that kind of a social media company is really great for everybody. I mean, I'm a huge fan of what they do. So I don't think you could blanket say that, but yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of people aren't going outside and meeting new people. They're trying to meet new people, on their phones. Or what I like to call the tiny televisions. Like
on that note, since you've been in this semi-tiny television for the last hour and change, thank you so much, Greg. Always fun to have you. I think we cover a lot of interesting territory. So thank you for all of us. A pleasure to have you in these very peculiar venues.
Yep. That was great. I really enjoyed the questions a lot. We should have just skipped the talk.
Yeah. Bye, Greg.
It's good to see all my friends. Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Bye, Greg.
All right, thanks.